Hello, good evening, everyone. Wonderful to have you here. Welcome to the Walker Art Center. I'm Amanda Hunt, Head of Public Engagement, Learning, and Impact, of which Teen Programs is a part. Before moving into the evening, I want to acknowledge the land that we're all sitting on, and through the words of our 2022 Walker Art Center Teen Arts Council's words. The Walker Art Center and Teen Arts Council acknowledge and respect the contemporary and ancestral homeland of the Dakota, Ojibwe, and other indigenous nations. Additionally, WACTAC acknowledges the impact of colonization in Minnesota. The importance of land is essential to all cultures. We recognize the impact of the intentional destruction toward Native communities through oppressive policies and genocides. The members of WACTAC encourage you to support Native causes through donation, education, and/or protest. We strive to validate Indigenous communities and support the path toward equity for all. With that, we're gathered here tonight to celebrate and deepen the work of teen programs. Thank you all for being here. We know you've come from Australia, Denver, Canada. Thank you. Incredible to have you here. The Walker started our Teen Arts Council in 1996. It's still highly debated between Mocha and the Walker who was first. And it remains one of the crown jewels of our intergenerational programming here at this museum. We produced our first teen toolkit in 1999. Simona, I don't have a show and tell moment for us. I forgot. And realized after many phone calls and emails over the decades, it might be time for a new one. So the Museum Teen Programs How-To Kit was produced thanks to the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences Services. Thank you for funding it. And thanks to my predecessor, Nisa Mackey, for seeding it. I hope you all have a chance to peruse. We'll have it available to look at. It is now free for download so that everyone can use it. I'm sure Simona will speak to it at some point during the evening. And tonight's really about gathering and talking through the meaning behind working with youth, with our teens, what that means in an institution, what that means in a society, how we can support and cultivate civic participants at this stage in life. It's really critical in so many ways. So for that and for this tonight, Simona, thank you, our Walker Teen Programs Manager, for delivering the book and this evening's symposium with love and care throughout. I want to welcome, before we get started, Professor and Cultural Anthropologist Mimi Ito, Social Justice and Critical Youth Studies Professor Julio Cammarota, and Stephen Kwok, Curator of Public Engagement at Dia Art Foundation. These three will be in a gorgeous conversation moderated by Simona Zappis, our program coordinator. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming these four to the stage.
Hi. Thank you all so much for coming. I think most of the people in this room are educators, so you know that I'm going to say, like, come in, get closer, be comfortable, make the space what you need it. But I think, too, because most of the folks in this room tonight are educators, that we're coming into this night because we're interested in being able to find spaces that really validate the stakes of the work that we do, and understanding that when building knowledge with young people, there are high stakes, that we care about their development, we care about them as people, and we care about the spaces that we're in, and the kind of like what is going on in the spaces that we're in. And so that's really kind of what we're thinking about tonight, is how we navigate these and understand the histories, the challenges, the forces that are surrounding us, and kind of like how we can honor the young people without trying to make assumptions for who they are and what they need, and being able to co-create space with them. So that's something that we'll have time to introduce everybody, but something I'm really happy that as we were preparing for this, that we thought about that tonight we're not going to speak for the youth, we're going to speak from our own experiences and thinking about our experiences as researchers, as educators, as museum workers, as professors, to be able to think about, like, what can we bring to help resource each other? So without further ado, I'm hoping that you each could just introduce yourselves. And again, because we're all educators here, let's introduce some shared vocabulary. I'd love to hear if you have any kind of terms that you think would be helpful as we're joining this conversation tonight, just to bring everybody onto the same page and have some shared working language. But most importantly, who are you?
Thank you, Simona, for that intro, and Amanda as well. My name is Stephen Kwok. I'm the curator of public engagement at Dia Art Foundation, and I'm an artist and an educator as well. And I know we're going to get into a lot of the other work that we all do, so I'll kind of jump to the vocabulary and thinking about kind of a word or concept to share tonight. I kind of am drawing from an artist educator that is currently working in our teen program at Dia. And his word that he's building his curriculum off of is opacity. Shout out to Gerardo Ismael Madero, by the way. And opacity is a concept that he's taking from Glissant and thinking about kind of the inverse of transparency and how we kind of maybe often align transparency with this objective. But what happens when we think about opacity or the right to be opaque, and so the right to not be understood? And that's something I've been thinking a lot in relationship to our work at Dia currently. There's also a lot of other terms that we are often using that if I use throughout this talk and they are like esoteric concepts that I'm happy to define as well. Then I'll pass it to you.
Great, thank you. I'm Mimi Ito. I'm a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm a cultural anthropologist of digital youth culture. Most of my research and career has been studying what young people do when they take up the technologies of the day and how digital and network technology has really given young people a new platform for exercising agency, voice, for mobilizing as platforms to share their creative work and build communities. So those are the dynamics that, have kind of fueled my work. By way of sort of co-opting keywords to self-centered introduction of my keywords. I think the keywords I'll talk about, or the vocabulary words, are some of the terms that have sort of circulated into practice and design within informal and youth development settings. One was it was actually an acronym from the title of one of the large ethnographic studies we did of youth digital media engagement, where we identified 3 genres of how young people were engaging with new technologies, hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, which got shortened into homago, which actually became almost a verb in some of the contexts, which just blew my mind. And I deserve absolutely no credit for how homago got taken up within the design of youth spaces within museums and libraries, but it's been, sort of one of the most joyful and gratifying parts of my career to see how creative and equity-oriented educators have taken up what was basically a set of descriptive terms from our research. And then the other term that I'll put out there is a concept that was actually inspired by a lot of the kind of teen media and creative spaces that grew up in museums and libraries, like, the kinds of programs you see here, or the U Media Learning Labs that originated in Chicago and was later supported by IMLS and MacArthur to spread to, I think, 24 different settings, museums and libraries around the country. But those experiments, together with other work around game-based learning and other youth engagement contexts, we collaboratively between practitioners and researchers developed this model called connected learning, which is really about learning that's centered on young people's authentic interests, identities, their what Julio will describe as their culture, community cultural wealth. I'm not gonna blow your vocabulary word for you. No spoilers yet. But in a way that's socially connected, but also tied to opportunity, right? So what we were seeing with a lot of the digital engagements is that young people were geeking out, doing amazing things, mobilizing online, building communities, but that grown-ups and learning institutions or career institutions weren't necessarily recognizing that agency and voice and meeting young people where they are, or acknowledging the power and agency they had in ways that opened up doors of opportunity. And the connected learning model was really a framework to understand how we can see that the new digital world was creating these opportunities for surfacing that power and agency and creativity that's always existed among young people, but that grownups needed to step up and, integrate the opportunity and opening access to sites of power of that form of youth agency. So happy to talk more. We've been expanding this concept to like a connected art learning and arts framework, as well as connected well-being and other dimensions. But it's really a large community of researchers and practitioners that have been championing this framework.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Simona. Thank you for engaging us in a conversation. I'm excited about this. My name is Julio Cammarota. I'm a professor of social cultural studies in the College of Education at the University of Arizona. So oh, my family's here. Right on, family. How are you? I'm gonna call you out. I can't see you. I wish I could see you, but I know where you're at though. So yes, I'm a professor at the University of Arizona, and my expertise is around youth participatory action research, which I'll talk about that because it's very relevant to this conversation. For those of you that don't know about youth participatory action research, it is a form of research or a form of inquiry where young people engage in a particular problem of their own social context, and they address that problem and try to bring changes to their social context, try to improve the situation. The way that we normally go about doing YPAR work is that we frame it around critical race theory, and the basic. Critical race theory, there's a lot of different components to it, a lot of different tenets, but the most important tenet that we use when we're doing youth participatory action research is the tenet that racism is central, right? Racism in this country, in this context, whenever you're working with young people, an entree point into their own social context, it's good to talk about how race and racism is central to their experiences, but also to the experiences of other people within their social context. We also use this idea of funds of knowledge, this idea that there are assets within the communities that young people come from, and in particular, communities of color, working class communities. They have cultural practices that are, in particular, are used to challenge very austere, difficult living, oppressive living circumstances. So they have cultural practices that are used to contend with those circumstances. We then elevate it, and I'm so glad my family's here, but Regina, are you here? Yeah, okay. Regina Delamen, and is Ashley here? No. Okay. Those are two of my really wonderful, lovely colleagues and friends, good friends, who we sort of developed this idea of creative resistance, and I'll talk more about it later. But it's a spin-off of Funds of Knowledge in the sense that young people engage in creative expression that is a form of knowledge, but it's a form of knowledge that addresses challenging, oppressive circumstances. But the beauty behind it, the creativity, the artistic creativity, is also about visioning, right? Visioning a future, or visioning possibilities, dreaming about what life could be without that oppressive circumstances or oppressive situation. So those are my initial comments.
I know it's hard not to applaud. We can applaud. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the shared vocabulary. And I think what's also helpful is to be able to kind of ground it in what it's like when it's felt and what it's like in action. And so I'm hoping that you could each maybe provide a snapshot of what your work kind of looks like in practice, or when it's felt, or when you're in these institutional spaces.
Should I go first?
Any order.
Okay, sure. So I've been at DIA in this capacity as curator of public engagement for a little over a year and a half, but began working with DIA in 2017 as an artist educator for our AEP program, which it works with second graders in Beacon or the Hudson Valley, and moved through many different educational initiatives with working alongside Alex Vargo and Megan Mattingly, who are the kind of LNE team at DIA. And so since I've taken on this position as curator of public engagement, I have inherited the Teens program that's based in Chelsea. We have two programs, and one in Beacon and one in Chelsea that that we really think about in tandem with each other. And our Chelsea program is developed in collaboration with the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development. So we work with the city on that program. And they come and meet at DIA Chelsea once a week on Wednesday nights. And then in the summer, we transition to for a 6-week intensive. I've also, in my capacity, started a pilot program called Activations, in which we work with the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. So we really like civic partnerships at DIA, and kind of building off actually of DIA's history of having some unusual civic partnerships. For instance, we have a work in Times Square, a Max Neuhaus piece, that is embedded within a subway grate in Times Square, and that requires a very unique relationship with MTA. So our education program and learning program and public engagement program is trying to build off of that ethos. And I walked over to the Chelsea Recreation Center, which is about 5 blocks away from DIA Chelsea, about a year ago, and asked them if they wanted to do some programming, and they were just totally like, yeah, sure. And so we've very organically built a relationship where I bring artists into the rec center, which is a 6-story public facility that has a swimming pool and, ping pong and all these different types of rooms. And the artists respond to this space and think about a way in which they can bring their practices to the public in an interactive way. And we invite the public of all ages to come. So we've had, a miniature sculpture kind of workshop where we've installed tiny sculpture all across the center. We've had an inflatable sculpture workshop. We've had kind of a experimental sound installation that remixes the sounds of a basketball scrimmage. They're conceptual programs. They're also programs that we hope that people will really be able to step into their own creativity in and experiment and kind of just be alongside artists and alongside each other. And so in all of this work, I would say the thing that really links it together is thinking about not what necessarily how to make a program, but how to make an environment in which people can come, feel welcomed, and feel like maybe they can take a risk and kind of step outside of some of their usual patterns or behaviors with each other and take advantage of the resources that we provide. And so we talked a lot about snacks, but we really think about the seating arrangement, we think about the snacks, we think about all the different aspects of space. And that's kind of what Activations is really hoping to do as well, is to create the opportunity for artists to really respond and kind of design and facilitate these spaces for exchange. So that's a bit of what's happening in my role at DIA.
I love that example because, I always try to co-opt people's work into connected learning because this is like a perfect example of connected learning. And one of the more challenging things is exactly what you were describing. A lot of organizations that we work with honestly struggle to build partnerships and community in that more network and community engaged way with other institutions. So thank you for that lovely example. That's a better example than I could have generated on my own. One of the core principles being, it's centered around young people's interests, identities, but ideally, just like the digital world has kind of exploded the boundaries of where we live, work, play, and it's not anchored in institutions in quite the same way anymore. When we do research on how young people develop a sense of efficacy, identity, career identity as a learner, if they can tie it to something they're authentically interested in, arts is often at the center of young people's interests. We see the development not as like what the formal system thinks of a pipeline, like you keep pushing kids through this pipeline, but it looks more like a process of building and complexifying and enriching your relational infrastructure. So it looks like network building. And when young people have a resilient network of people in different locations and they're learning ecology, whether it's in schools or museums or libraries or community-based organizations, when the kids that feel held and supported in developing their learning and agency are the young people who are able to build these webs of connections. So I think that example is beautiful. One of the historical examples that launched a lot of the connected learning work is the UMedia Learning Lab at the Harold Washington Library in downtown Chicago, where it was the first time, it was a big risk for them. They opened up this, 4,000 square foot space, I think, right, facing the main street just for teens. And they did the things, like it was the first time you could just hang out, watch videos. So this was the Homago part. They could bring food into the library for the first time. So food, like bringing their whole person into the spaces. They could just hang out and play video games. They didn't have to be on task. I think the educators keep pushing them into like the geeking out and workshops, but they could just show up. And when the teens first walked into that space, and they were like, wait, this is for us. We can do whatever we want. And then it just spread word of mouth. And it was very organic, the way the space welcomed the teens. But it was those subtle maybe not so subtle, but it was those design decisions about making it a space that young people could bring their whole identities and their friendships and be themselves. But that there was still this effort to offer very specialized equipment and mentorship with teaching artists and that intergenerational connection. So it wasn't just about the hanging out, but it was that access to a new set of relationships that might not have existed before.
Great. As I said earlier, I have experience, about 20 years experience working and organizing youth participatory action research projects. And there's 3 projects that I want to just briefly talk about. The first is the Social Justice Education Project, which was the main social science program. This was a youth participatory action research project, but it was the main social science program in Mexican American Studies in Tucson Unified School District. And I don't know if, it got national news because the Mexican American Studies was banned in 2010, and my program was banned as well, which was very devastating. This was life work, establishing this program, and we went for about a decade before the ban came about. But the focus of the program, once again, we took a critical race theory perspective or framework, and the students were looking at racism at their school, and that's probably the reason why they got banned, because the state superintendent of public instruction, his name is Tom Horn. He is currently now the state superintendent of public instruction. But at that time, he didn't believe that racism existed. So he didn't know why we were having these kinds of conversations and these kinds of dialogues and this kind of work. So that was a point of contention. Then the next project worked in Iowa this was in Ames, Iowa, which is the town where Iowa State University is. And we were working at a middle school doing a YPAR project with young people of color who were attending a predominantly white institution or predominantly white school. And the YPAR focused on their experiences as students of color in this context. And then the last project work, and his most recent project work, is working in Puerto Rico with my colleagues, who I introduced, or at least called out, shout out over there. And we working at the University of Puerto Rico with undergraduate students. Now, we have a pretty wide range of what youth is. So youth, I've seen today, I saw one the numbers around what considered youth 5 to 25. So it's pretty, and it's interesting because, we could talk about that later. It's like 5 to 25, there's a lot of developmental differences and from that age range. But anyway, we were working with mainly like 20 and 21-year-olds. And from my perspective, and they were okay actually identifying as young people, as youth. This project was a wonderful project. It's life-changing for myself, and I know for my colleagues who are here too as well. But the young people, the undergraduates, did a YPAR project focusing on their experiences after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, right? So what was it like to be a college student after Hurricane Maria? And they looked at all the psychological trauma that they experienced. They looked at a lot of the government negligence that happened after Hurricane Maria. They looked at the creation of art and how art was a form of resistance, right? And they also looked at just resistance in general. So I'm gonna describe to you a situation how we sort of recognized that what the young people were engaged in was this form of creative resistance. One of the students, or actually several of the students, brought in artifacts, things that they created during this period, post-period of the hurricane. And one of the students brought in these plastic soda containers and sort of cut them out so that they would be planters, right? And then painted these planters very colorful, like in very colorful ways. And so we had the student describe, what is the purpose of these planters and why do they created them. The student said that the colors represent light, because they were living in a moment of darkness, right? So this is very much, this is the creative side of it, right? The creative resistance. So they're resisting the dismal reality of darkness, of living in darkness consistently, because they had no electricity, right? So they created these planters colorfully, and then they put plants in them, and then they gave the plants to their neighbors, right? As a gesture of life. So we thought, wow, this is visioning, beyond just a simple arts project. This is visioning beyond that. So we then thought that this was a form of resisting. They're resisting the dismal circumstances, the lack of government involvement in helping them out, and they're resisting it in a way that allows them to see an alternative reality, a reality with life, with color. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. And I think it's really helpful to have these snapshots of what this work looks like as we move into this next question of thinking about zooming out a little bit and being able to talk about the context that we're representing, or that perhaps other folks in the room might be representing, of the spaces that we're working in. So how does the broader context of the work, the nature of your institution that you're in, maybe like we can think about things like staffing practices or histories, or like who is working there, who's there, to be able to think about its impact on the work that we do.
I can go. So I'm going to answer that from my institution, from the perspective of my institution. So I work at a higher education institution. And in terms of YPAR work, the institution is not set up to support YPAR work. What the institution is set up to do is for us to get grant money, to collect data, and then write it up. That's more or less what we're required to do. So, but YPAR is very different than that. We can do all those things, and we've done in terms of this last project in Puerto Rico. We did, write a grant. We did collect data, and we did write it up. But there is a level of relationships that go on in YPAW work that's important. These are not just short-lived relationships. For instance, the social justice education project, which I mentioned, that we did 20 years ago, that we started 20 years ago, I still know some of the students, and I have a very good friend. Her name is Kim Dominguez, who I not only have I seen her develop through the YPAR project and become a really incredible social justice warrior. Kim also took my classes in college, right, as a college professor. So I was working with her in high school at 15 years old, and she took classes in my college, in undergraduate classes, and then she also took graduate classes of mine and got a graduate degree. Then she works at a resource center on campus, and there was a struggle. I'm not going to go into the deep struggle around it, but a struggle around maintaining these cultural resource centers. And then it was important. She reached out to me to help her. So this is the sort of like kinds of relationships that develop. It's not just a one-time shot, the typical research kind of approach to developing those kinds of relationships. These are very long-term relationships that develop over time. And there is a word I forgot to I forgot to mention it in the vocabulary. But there's a word by Falsborda. Falsborda is a sociologist who really developed participatory action research from Colombia, and he calls this word vivencia, which means to live. To live with you. You can't just, when you're doing participatory action research, you have to live in the struggle with the people, right? With the people you're doing the work with. So this is an example of vivencia, living with the struggle.
I can build off of that a bit and talk a little bit also about like long-term engagement.
Right.
So in terms of the context of DIA and how that might impact programs, education programs within it, we, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of try to draw from really, I think, from the work, I would say, like some of the core works that have been started DIA's history. So if we think about a project like the Lightning Field, which exists in remote New Mexico and has been installed since the 1970s and is very hard to get to, but and you have to stay overnight in order to view it. There are these kind of quite extreme and quite specific ways of viewing art. And I think when thinking about that experience, that's something that we like to draw on when we're developing programs or thinking about how to shape our programs. And so one of those values is long-term sustained engagement, because in thinking about kind of viewership of an artwork and it existing for a very long time, or for exhibitions that are up for a year or longer, that you can return back to the works and you can potentially see how you might have changed in relationship to them. So that's kind of this poetics, right, of long-term engagement. But when it gets realized in our teen program, for instance, that could be in the form of Kyra, who is our program coordinator now in learning and engagement, but was one of the very first teens in Dia Beacon. And so she has this history of having gone through 4 years of the teen program there, then became an intern, and then now is on staff. And I myself moved, as I said, through many different roles before landing in this role. So that's a kind of shared across a lot of departments at the institution. It's not unique to just learning, but I would say something that we really like to try to encourage, because especially in New York City in Beacon, I would say it's a little bit easier to grasp because time feels like it moves slower upstate. And in New York City, things just move very, very fast. And so especially the youth that we're engaging through our partnership with the city, there's the average pace of how they're moving through different programs or through different spaces is just really, really fast. So we really try to slow it down and encourage them to stay as long as possible. And they carry the mantle from one year to the next to try to, build their ability to shape the program. So the longer that you're engaged with a place, the more that you also can tap into, your agency, ideally, in how you might begin to affect some change. So.
I don't have an example per se, but I just wanted to comment that I love both of your stories because I think it's so clear that you're working in spaces that sit between different institutional structures that challenge canonical ways of doing things, and I think that's one of the themes of our conversation today. That we're, for those of us who are engaged with young people in this country, the most diverse, most educated generation ever, who demands certain things and things being done differently. In my little corner of the world, which is probably similar to Julio's, although I don't do the same kind of deep work that Julio is doing, but what I try to do is educate emerging generation of scholars to consider ways of gaining status and reputation in ways that are different from that traditional scholarly mode. But it's difficult, right? Like, I'm sure the work you're doing is quite disruptive to a lot of norms in the traditional way of doing things. So we talk about wanting to disrupt the canon or decolonize education, but then what it really feels like is this drag, this resistance, and this constant sort of lack of validation often. But I think what sustains us are those relationships. And that's because we don't have institutional infrastructure. The relational infrastructure becomes that much more important for both, all of us, for this kind of intergenerational work. So these are such beautiful examples of that.
And I think that comment is like the most perfect segue to my next question of thinking about youth programs within institutional spaces. I'm curious what the different flows of power you all feel like you can identify within those programs. And I think, too, it's helpful to think about institutional spaces as like museums or universities or libraries or even within schools, too.
Well, flows of power is a great way to put it, I'll say. I think in thinking about, I knew we would kind of potentially touch on power and the exchange of power or not exchange of power. And I was just kind of meditating on this idea of power, and that's threaded throughout a lot of the work, on a day-to-day basis. But, I think it's impossible to get rid of power, right? Power just exists. And so it's more about, being able to exchange it or to allow for it to take different shape. And that's maybe one thing that I think about in the teen program, is what does it look like for power to be expressed through this program? And I was sharing with you all earlier that we took our teens down to the new exhibition of Delcy Morelos' work, and they have, because of this long-term engagement idea, they have a level of comfortability with being in an exhibition space, especially at DIA. When we're kind of outside, it shifts a little bit, but that there was so much laughter and intimacy and kind of camaraderie within that space that it felt to me, I felt that was a form of power. And so I don't know, I can't speak to saying that, power flows, it doesn't flow equitably, right? Throughout, all the bigger structures. But I'm interested in thinking about identifying moments of power within the program that we may not think of as power, or might be dismissed of as an interruption, or a distraction. But actually, those forms can be incredibly powerful. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's precisely what you're kind of asking, but I think, yeah, the flows, I mean, I want to encourage, more and more flows of that, and I'm sure we'll kind of get into even more of strategies of how to do that.
So flows of power. So we talked about this earlier. I see it as like institutional power, right? there's power of the youth, and then there's this sort of power that adults have who are working with youth, and I can talk about all three of them. So the institutional power is, say if we're talking about museums or schools, are engaged in I'm sorry, I'm an academic. I'm sorry, I'm going to reference people. That's what I do. So there's a sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu who talks about symbolic violence and what symbolic violence is. And he studied museums, how museums operate to reproduce inequalities through its power, right? Through representing only the cultural capital of the wealthy, of the middle class or wealthy, right? And so he also talked about symbolic violence, how not only are these representations of high cultural power, they also symbolically are violent against the culture of people who come from working class or communities of color. That's what the term symbolic violence means. So it's important for us to recognize that if you have a museum or an institution or a school, what have you, that the type of curriculum may validate, say, a Eurocentric perspective or American Eurocentric perspective, but at the same time they're doing damage, right? They're doing destructive damage to the culture of the people, right? So that's one form of power. And then there is the power of young people. So young people can, engage in this type of work, the youth pedestrian action research, and can demonstrate power by having a critical perspective, and then try to challenge that power by providing alternatives to what already exists, to the symbolic violence that already exists. So, but the issue, the problem is with us, the adults. I hate to say this, but once young people, not all adults, but some adults, once young people sort of exert that power, adults become afraid, right? They become afraid of the power that young people have. They become afraid because they feel like they are threatened. Young people are threatening their power and privilege, right? By calling them out, calling out the power and privilege that exists within certain political arenas, political landscapes, power that government officials have, power that people in these high important positions have, and they start calling them out, and then they become afraid because those people that are in positions of power, adults in positions of power, have to then, they're forcing them to reflect on themselves, and they don't want to do that, right? They don't want to do that. So yeah, and then I have to also talk about myself, the power that I have in these situations with working with young people. I'm an older man, I'm a full professor, I'm heterosexual. So there are a lot of, we use the term intersectionality to talk about how there are multiple forms of oppression that can converge and intersect within an individual or within a particular group. For instance, there could be someone who is a Black woman, queer, right? Those are intersecting forms of oppression. But also intersectionality, and this is a conversation I had earlier, intersectionality can also be how my privileges and how my power also intersects to create a certain kind of grid in which I have more power over other people. So, I just said I'm a man, right? That provides me with power and privilege. I also said that I'm heterosexual. That provides me with power and privilege. I also said that I'm a full professor, which provides me with, the educational professional power and privilege. So we have to be mindful of how our own intersections around power can also sort of dominate and also create a dynamic in a situation where you're working with young people, create a dynamic in which your power sort of interferes with the kinds of things that young people want to do, the kinds of work that they want to do, and kinds of changes they want to bring.
I really appreciate your just really calling out the intergenerational or the age-based power dynamics in addition to the complexity of all of the other intersectional forms of power. That's a conundrum that I think in my field of, digital use studies is a very salient one, because the other dimension of power is how the alliances shift when there are new technologies and changes, or something like the pandemic hits. And age-based oppression is probably the most taken for granted form of oppression across societies, but it's a weird one, right? Because you grow out of it, like the oppressed grow up to become the oppressors. So it's a very different kind of power than or power dynamic than other forms. And it's like with new technology, like we did a bunch of research when teens first got access to mobile phones, for example, and it was so disruptive of the power dynamics of control that adults used to exert over young people's communication. It was absolutely revolutionary for young people to be able to have private communications that weren't surveilled by adults. And we forget these kind of simple things. And so, but then young people get judged. It's like, oh, you're just staring at your phone, or you never get out of the house. But it's like, okay, we've shut down spaces for kids to be able to congregate safely and have agency in physical spaces. They go to gaming spaces and text messaging. That's an exertion of power. And the complicated dynamic is like whose pockets are being lined by the consolidation of tech. We're seeing, like, even with the most recent incursion of ChatGPT in educational settings, that is tremendously disruptive of the power dynamic of a lot of traditional educational modes. Just like, professors have been like, oh, we got to ban the phones, we got to ban the laptops. Like, this is a power play. This is an intergenerational power play that we're in the middle of. And it affects all of our institutions in terms of the flows through these kind of obligatory, like in space, we used to have to come to spaces like this to share knowledge. And all of those dynamics are being disrupted. And young people have really been the tip of the spear of it, not because, I think developmentally young people tend to be more idealistic and have more energy and other things like that. But we forget that the reason why young people have been at the forefront of innovation, creativity around technology is because of their lack of power and access to certain modes of communication and expression. And that has been the driver of, the majority of innovation in the digital space.
Can I add something to this? Thank you, Mimi. That was wonderful. I just thought of something too. I mentioned someone earlier. Her name is Kim Dominguez, who started off in the YPAR project, and I've known Kim for 20 years. The reason why I love Kim is because Kim uses her power to put me in check, right? She uses her power to call me out for the power that I have and how I have, been sort of negatively impacted the experiences of young people. And I love that. I love that. We have to be mindful of how young people's power can also be directed towards us who are working with young people, to sort of that intergenerational. We have to be mindful of those critiques and be able to listen to them with an open mind and be able to learn and grow. So it's like, I'm not, young people are in this process of youth participatory action research as a form of development, of developing their critical consciousness. But I'm also in the process too, and I'm learning from young people as well to become a better person, a better human being.
Yeah, absolutely. I can just say from lived experience that it's, I'm on the group chat, you know what I mean? and I'm a participating member of the group chat, which means I am also open to be, talked about on the group chat. So I just think that, there are moments in which you just have to let things ride, and you have to, and I think this idea that, it may not always be about taking power, but it also might be about relinquishing power. I know we're talking about that, but I just almost want to name that as well. It's to say, in this, maybe in a predisposed way or in a conditioned way, this is when we would try to stop something from happening or try to get a certain thing to happen. But I think just merely abstaining can also be a way in which to allow for power to grow or imbalances to kind of become further balanced.
So I think you all can tell power is the big topic tonight and the excitement in the room. And there are a lot of questions about it. So I'm going to use my power as the moderator to maybe combine the next questions, because I think we're already starting to do it, and to just like bring everyone along with us, that I'm really interested in kind of naming in these contexts, these institutional contexts, how teens exert power. And I'm interested too if there's a meaning or there's a difference between teens exerting power in an institutional space versus feeling empowered. And I want to kind of reflect that same question to the educators who are working with young people, to kind of think about how educators can exert their power or feel empowered without, and that of young people without co-opting the young people's power or tokenizing it or reproducing any negative power structure. So kind of thinking about empowered versus holding power, and then just why it's important. And just keeping doing what you're doing.
Something that comes to mind for me, and this is, I think I'm still forming this thought, but is this idea of, we're talking about collectives, like in this conversation, we're talking about certain kind of age groups in relationship to others. And I think that there's so much, the first thing that comes to mind is like about an individual negotiation of power. And I think I'm kind of honing in on the reproducing element of potentially being an educator, and how in my own experience, I feel that I have to do more work within myself to be able to hold certain ideas to be true and not to have to share or reproduce them either through like literally telling people about all of these things that are frustrating to me. And that's just something I've kind of been working on, is about how to kind of be able to become a translator in some way, or like the act of translation in my work, if that's landing for anyone. But yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the nod to the kind of collective impact and sort of bringing things together or knitting things together. And, I think one of the things that we've really focused on in the connected learning community, and why the arts communities and programs are so kind of iconic to connected learning, is that the coming together where we see the, not like just the individual exertion of power in an interaction, but like exercising power comes from building shared purpose and community and collective power. Like that's what ultimately it means to shift beyond just like, not saying something explicitly offensive, or like some of these kind of micro interactions, to, really changing structures. And when people come together, we find that young people and old people, we have fun and we do things together when we have shared interests, purpose, a sense of shared culture and community. And that's the piece that is, when we talk about the design of really robust connected learning environments, we see an element which we call affinity-based mentorship. And that could be just like, oh, everybody loves skateboarding or whatever. It could be just a shared interest, or it could be, a sense of an activist cause, or, a cultural or racial or ethnic identity. There can be a lot of things that bring people together. But those are the things that when people are united in a common purpose, that the learning, we talk about learning as a side effect of people coming together with common purpose and something that they care about together. And that's what I think of as actually exerting power rather than power, power as an individual experience.
So when I'm thinking of the question, exertion of power and exertion of power in institutional context, I automatically come up with identity, right? That young people have very complex, deep, meaningful identities, and in many cases, the institutional context does not connect with those identities. So it's a good or an exertion of power would be how can we change the institutional context so it parallels the identities that young people have, because that's for working with young people. Expression of identity is very meaningful, very meaningful. So it's important to understand what are the mismatches that are going on in the institutional context, whether it's schools, museums, whatever we're talking about. How can those young people can be engaged in a process of praxis, which is reflecting and taking action in order to change those institutional contexts so that their identities become empowered.
I clearly love to talk about power here. And so I think that maybe this is to kind of move a little from this space. And I think that this is a little bit of sometimes an impossible question, but do you think that there's any essential tools that educators can use to help meaningfully exert this? And I think that we kind of named some of this already of talking about these relationships and networks, but I think it's also, I just want to give more space for it too to help resource everybody here tonight.
Well, I mean, is this a tool? This might be like an anti-tool. I think absence is really important, and that's something that we try to build into, or like at least when I'm working with our artist educators, I also, and we're looking at curriculum and trying to create a lot of space in which the participants, the teens can kind of engage with each other, where we may not know everything about what's going on. And I think I open to like with the word opacity, but I think that recognizes and creates space for not every single aspect of their experience to be understood, and for them to not feel that they need to somehow express and prove that something is happening for them in a certain way. I think that kind of implicit expectation can be felt when it's not even when it's not named, and so when I was an artist educator at DHLC in its pilot year, there were just moments of time in which I would leave the room, and just not be in the room. They would have studio time and they would just make, and whatever happened would happen, and I wouldn't try my best to not ask what happened as well. So that is kind of a tool. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a tool, but I do think it is something that I've tried to meditate on over the years.
I mean, maybe an approach or a orientation. I think in some of the work that we've been doing in kind of reconceptualizing library spaces or trying to understand what institutions need to do to change from kind of a more transactional to a relational model. We've described it in those terms because and I think there may be parallels with the museum world in that this idea of like curating and sharing collections, like that transaction has been very central to the identity of libraries, and shifting to a more relational approach. Been working with Kimberly Hirsch and Linda Braun in this space. It's a different mindset, I think, that educators understand that, but the institutional structures may not always see that if the metrics are about circulation and attendance, for example. So, I think and then the approach to doing it looks different. Like, it is about this long-term relationship building, or, the other piece that we've been seeing a lot in our partnerships with out-of-school educators, especially after the pandemic, is a more awareness of health and well-being and kind of holistic care, physical needs, infrastructural barriers to attendance. Suddenly, all of these things that are in the home environments of young people became more visible to people, educators. I mean, we already always knew there was diversity and inequity and accessibility and, what people came in the door with. But then I think that awareness has really accelerated. And whether Stephen was joking about how we always have to have food, but I mean, those things, they really matter. And I think that treating, simply creating space for creative expression, like a lot of the programs we work with are STEM focused programs that can have a very kind of knowledge and skills approach, but even the move to STEAM and bringing creative approaches into STEM is revolutionary for that field, because it allows people to show up with their full selves and to be creative and express joy like you were describing. So those feel like it's not necessarily a tool, but it's almost like a mindset or approach and just simply asking, how are you doing? What do you need? And that kind of orientation. I've seen a pretty big shift across a lot of folks in youth development and informal learning settings to embrace that kind of mindset. It's been really powerful. I mean, I haven't been at the front of it. I'm just an observer, but it's been really powerful to see that.
One of the things that is very important in terms of a tool in YPAR is the question, right? And that's important for me as a researcher. Is question has always been a powerful tool, powerful intellectual tool. Then this is something that is shared with young people. It's like, what question do you want to ask that you want to learn about? A question that you want to ask that's bothering you, that's meaningful, that is about your life, your experiences, and how to once again, bring changes, to be able to go into a form of transformation, transforming whatever injustice that exists within the social context. So the young people should be empowered to create their own questions, to create their own questions, so that they can then engage in the sort of intellectual process of learning through that question, and then using that question as a form of praxis, as a way to not only understand intellectually, but be able to go about and learn through making changes.
Really a night of perfect segues. Because we have one final question that we'll go through before we open up the floor for questions from everybody else. But I'm just kind of curious, just to briefly hear if you think that over the course of the work you've done, if there is something that is unique about this moment that I think Mimi touched on really well, that thinking about during COVID with the digital spaces, but kind of in this moment afterwards, as we're kind of like moving along.
Yeah, it does feel like a bit of a cliche to say, we're living in interesting and transformative times, but it really does feel a bit like that. The combination of factors and, the fact that COVID, we just completely shook the snow globe and, started, revisited a lot of our ingrained practices and assumptions of how we relate, how we communicate. We have no idea what AI is going to do, but if history is any guide, we should completely expect that young people will be at the forefront of doing things that are going to be completely unexpected with these new tools. And the combination of, the global political situation, climate, it's really, a time that is challenging us to not do business as usual. So I think in that sense, it's very hard to predict, but if we can't listen and learn and be good allies with the younger generation who has a more clarity of voice and vision in these issues, then I think we're doomed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, absolutely. We are living in interesting times, and I think we have a wonderful new younger generation. I guess the label is Generation Z, and this generation has gone through major events, such as COVID, right? Also, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. Here we are in the city where George was murdered. So they've been through a lot of major movements, pandemics, different crises. Also, the advent of technology. So information is readily available. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good, but they have access to a lot of information. So, working with Generation Z students in high school, I work with students in high school and also at the college level too. They seem very open to different ideas, open to different possibilities, very expansive in terms of how they want to determine their own identities, their own sense of self, and just the times we are living in are incredible. But I think these are really wonderful, meaningful, and also encouraging times, because the younger generation I think are going to for instance, my colleague Regina, her daughter Soluna is the most amazing person in the world, right? Because she's a part of this generation that's really thoughtful, very very engaged, really wants to see a different kind of world that exists. So I feel very hopeful.
Something I didn't mention about our teen program in Chelsea is that we work with the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development to bring students in, and the overwhelming majority of our students come from under-resourced communities and are of color, and same with our staff as well. And I think one thing that feels very new to me, and it's something that's just been kind of brewing and developing over the past couple of years, is that I don't feel like we need to do the work of proving why we're there. And I think that is honestly something that feels very new. And so if we don't have to do all that work, then it opens up the possibilities to so many more things. And that feels like something about our times.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you so much. This was so fabulous. And I want to make sure that we have time to hear from the incredible people in the audience, that we have a bit of time for some Q&A. And I'll just quickly share too that as we go through the Q&A, we'll have some QR codes up on the screen, so then you can continue to access our incredible panelists' work and thoughts. But I don't know if we could bring up the lights for the crowd a little bit and just see, does anybody have any questions? Hi. Yeah, Danny. Oh, we got a mic coming for you. This is the Walker Art Center.
Thank you so much. I had a question for Mimi. From early on in the conversation, you mentioned that you see a number of challenges in working with additional community partners, and especially kind of cross-sector. And I wonder if you could speak to why you in particular think that is at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not because people don't want to partner, but I think it's the institutionalized kind of accountability systems are usually like very program or institution specific. So organizations get credit for the number of youth they're serving. And there's even some competition between organizations, frankly, to try to rather than say, oh, our job is to broker youth out of our program. We don't get credit for brokering youth out of our programs. We get credit for bringing youth into our programs. And so but from a young person's point of view, you want to like go experience all the things that will help you, pursue your interest or your goals. And I think that's one of the really challenging things about just structurally how nonprofits are funded and what funders look at when they're evaluating the effectiveness of programs. So as researchers, like this little piece that we can add to the ecosystem is to sort of surface the power that happens when organizations are actually coordinating programs and referring kids across programs, things that it's sort of the invisible labor that educators are doing as mentors, but that doesn't get counted. So we have this project right now with the STEM Next Network, which is an interesting network because their job is to like coordinate across statewide, out of school STEM programs, a project that's specifically about surfacing and measuring the connection and coordination and handoffs between programs. And that we found that just simple awareness of the fact that these mechanisms matters has like tremendously boosted the retention and engagement of young people. So there's a lot of power in it, but I think it's kind of, it's sort of like what Julio was describing is like, you're doing this stuff out of love and passion, but your institution isn't necessarily giving you credit for it. And I feel like that's where some of the drag comes from in programs and organizations working together.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Carlene. I work for YWCA Minneapolis in several girls and youth programs. I'm struck, Stephen, yeah? I'm struck by the word, and the practice of absence and the need for adults whose work, especially in youth, is legitimized by our expertise and the fact that we can create curriculum because we have specific knowledge, and then we can implement this curriculum, and then we can legitimize our grant-funded dollars, for example, with a nonprofit. But I'm wondering, with the conversation of empowerment also, do you have examples of adults in youth work who are stepping out of being the leader or needing to be the expert in the room to carry the work forward in a different way? So for me, that has looked sometimes like stepping aside, but even the whole leading from behind, you still have to situate yourself as the expert to have your job or prove that you're deserving of the grant. So I think my question is boiling down to, have you seen or are you seeing examples of not just youth feeling empowered to move forward, but also adults ceding some power or stepping back or moving more into absence so that youth can fill space?
I think this is why I presented it as an anti-tool. Because I know it's provocation of some sort. It's very, very difficult in practice, when there is certain kind of responsibilities for safety and, to keep things at a safe space, for an adult to just be completely physically absent from the room. But I think, and yes, in certain instances, I would say that we build time in to like literally leave this library space that we work in and just have the youth in that space, knowing that, we're going to be down the hall in the kitchen, and to just allow them to do whatever they may do in this space. I think the idea, your question is around whether or not they're also kind of stepping forward in that absent space. And I think it's, not something that, I guess what I'm trying to get at is trying to remove ourselves from a results-driven framework, because even if we say we're absent, that doesn't mean they actually have to step into that space, but to continue the practice of opening that space and continuing to do that, even if we're not seeing it happen, I think is something that's quite difficult to do, but worthwhile doing, because then things emerge that are outside of our expectation. It's because when we are expecting results, we're imagining what form those results would be in. So trying to kind of suspend that imagination and just literally create space I think can potentially create, interactions that we're not really, we couldn't have come up with on our own. And we have, a DIA that's in the teen program specifically, that is something that we try to consistently do. And sometimes, they end up, the group may end up doing exactly what, they want to do a show at the end of the year, and that's okay, that's fine, let's do it. It whatever way it appears, it doesn't have to also appear to be super alternative. If they reproduce certain kind of structures of power or certain expectations, I think that's also okay. We don't have to constantly kind of manage in that space. So, yes, I guess, and hopefully so.
Good questions. Yeah, I see. If we can go, because there's someone right by Chase, and then afterwards we can end with the person in the back.
Hi, I wanted to ask, so I work at the National Gallery of Art, and I'm going to be working on teen programs, but they really just took a very big pause during COVID, and we're in a stage where we're doing a lot of exploring and research, and I feel very thankful to have this time and opportunity. And we're going in the direction of probably thinking about some sort of teen council down the line. But we're also wondering, like, how do we get teens involved before we get them involved? Like, how do we have their voice? A lot of the conversations we're having are with adults. We are, attending some workshops that do have teens there, but just trying to figure out how to bring them in the fold, sort of just from the jump.
So it's wonderful that you want young people to be at the table, but in many cases, adults need to be educated on how to work together collectively with young people, because in many cases, what I've seen when you bring young people to the table, they need to be prepared to understand that the adults will use their power to silence young people, and I've seen this happen numerous times. So it's important. That's why I'm an advocate for this youth distraction research, because it's an educational process. It helps to develop the students' critical consciousness and also their voice, right? And be able to negotiate these dynamics of power. So I'm a big advocate for that, that you have to do some kind of political education, education around power, and prior to engaging youth and putting them or having them on a council or having them in these positions where they are involved in decision making. So there has to be some educational work that needs to go prior to that.
Thank you. I think we have another question in the back. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So this isn't actually a question. It's actually a huge, deep appreciation for the discussion around power, giving, taking, ceding, it being taken, because I work for libraries and we're coming off, years of pandemic where we are a government building and had to enforce mask mandates with youth, and it broke trust completely, and it enforced a power dynamic that even as I supervise staff who work with youth, we need to be stepping back from that power dynamic. And so that gave me some excellent language to use as I supervise and support those staff and connect with youth. So just thank you.
And I think just a big message of thank you. Thank you to our incredible panelists. Thank you to our interpreter. Thank you to our incredible crew running the scenes. Thank you to the fabulous Walker staff. I want to shout out Mikhail Baker too, who made our incredible PowerPoint and the other half of our teen program. And I just want to thank all of you and say that for all the questions that are coming up, there's a lot of knowledge in this room, which is a great reason to have a little bit of a party. So I hope that you'll all join us for a reception immediately after this in Cardamom, which is our restaurant space. If you just walk straight out and keep walking, you'll bump into it. If you didn't get one when we came in, we have pink wristbands. I'm sure there's some folks who are ready to model it in the audience. That'll get you free snacks. And if you got those purple drink tickets, that'll get you free beer and wine and NA drinks. So thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very enjoyable. Thank you.